Hi and welcome. This time around we got another interesting product from Vevor to take a look at. This item is going to be of interest to people with both small and large mills alike, I think. Mostly because of the price point and its convenience. So this guy is a 3-inch AccuLock machine vise with a swivel base, supposedly. And the price is $79.99. I don't know how they could possibly, especially if it's ground. It claims that it's 80,000, made from 80,000 PSI cast iron, which makes it really high quality ductile cast iron. The clamping force is supposedly 15 kilonewtons, which works out to about 15,000 kilograms or 3,000 pounds roughly. Instead of 9.8 meters per second for gravity acceleration, I just rounded up to 10, but that's not far off. I'll be curious to see how flat square this guy is, or whether you're gonna need to do some work to make it useful. Comes with a manual, like so much as the Vevor, so many of the Vevor products, and the English is readable. It's a little off, but it's readable, which is kind of interesting. Apparently they make a whole range of these vices too, in a bunch of different sizes. And it comes with accuracy measurements for the vise, which I'm going to check out as well because I'm kind of curious about that. So it's got a baby Kurt style vise handle. So the Kurt was 3/4 of an inch. I wonder what size this is. It's going to probably be metric. We'll check that out. So we've got some bolts here. I'm guessing this is going to clamp down the rotary base, the vise to the rotary base. Nice packaging. And it comes pre-built. Oh, that's interesting. So those are actually to hold the vise down to a mill table. They actually include that. That's a little surprising. This is a cute little thing. Well, it supports keyways, which is interesting as well. I like that both the vise and the rotary base have keyways, and it's been ground. I just don't know how they can pull this off with the prices they're charging. Even if the grinding is, you know, moderate accuracy, it's still extra steps they have to perform and still somehow sell this thing for $79. I don't know how they pull it off personally. So there's lots of grinding dust in here. Lots of grinding grit left over, which should be cleaned off. But, you know, again, I'll say small sacrifice for the price of this thing. A Kurt 4-inch vise cost about the same as a Kurt 6-inch. So price-wise, we're in a pretty good range here. The jaws are supposedly hardened and removable. The rear jaw looks like it's keyed in like some of the older Kurt style used to be done. There's a lot of really sharp edges on this guy where it was ground. So they didn't, you know, chamfer the edges or anything after they ground it. But you know what? Again, I'm willing to do the work for the price point of this guy here. The motion of the vise is fairly consistent and smooth. All of these edges are really sharp, really sharp. You could definitely cut yourself on these, so be careful there. This guy measures 1/2 inch across the faces. But that guy is 0.472. Okay. 12 millimeter. Ah, no, that makes a lot more sense. So I'm guessing that's what they were shooting for. Can't quite get the box end around there. It sort of will sit only at an angle because there's not enough relief in the casting here. 17 millimeters, a little sloppy. 16 millimeters too tight. 5/8 is too small. 11/16 is very sloppy, so it's just a weird size nut. Everything is so sharp on this vise. definitely, even these chamfered edges are really sharp. So you're going to definitely want to deburr the daylights out of this guy, or relieve the edges on this guy before you play around with it, because you're definitely going to get cut. Finally got these bolts tightened. They were quite tight from the factory. This thing rotates it very smoothly. You can tell it's ground. There might be some grit in there because it sounds like there's something going on, but it is very smooth. I'll be curious to see how flat and parallel the base is, and same with the vise itself. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this off. They did not use high strength extra thick washers, which they should have. The washers actually deformed into the casting there. That's not great. Yep, plenty of grinding grit down there, which, as I rotate it there, was scoring the pretty ground surface they had on here. Everything is razor sharp, so they clearly ground it in place. So you definitely should take this apart the moment you get it, and don't even rotate it like I did there, because you'll scratch the ground surface. So I'm going to check some parallelism on this guy between the base and the top here, see how well ground it was. It looks like it's reasonable. So I wonder if this is an Anglock style vise, like the Kurt. Oh, that's interesting. And sure enough, it is. They push at 45 degrees. Although the Kurt has a hemispherical ball that fits in here. This guy, it's simply a piece that is into the cast iron here. They did add some grease that's kind of funky. I think I'll clean that out and replace it. So this guy is going to be non-repairable when it wears, unlike the Kurt, but for the price point, I think they're figuring it won't bother you that much. Although I got to say, I really dislike the idea of things being made to throw out. I'd rather they're repairable or, you know, parts upgradable. This guy was just machined, not ground, the bottom of the vise jaw, and that's why it's not as smooth. This has been ground, but this side has not been. And I might take this guy over to my surface grinder and just run a couple passes to clean this up, because this is a little bit rough here and it could be smoother. The top is ground, so the parts you can see, which is interesting. I think they should have continued and ground this as well, rather than just rough machine it. You can see the marks there. I want to take a look and see if they put thrust bearings in this guy. Okay, that's the preload. Oh, that's not threaded on. Boy, it sure felt like it was threaded on. A lot more grit in here. Definitely should take this guy apart and give it a good clean. Oh, they do have thrust bearings. Well, that's a very nice thing to see, actually. I am very glad. So that's how they are getting the force that this vise is supposed to be able to generate. I was wondering about that. The vise jaws are not super tight, which is pleasant considering how tight everything else was. The vise jaw itself is hardened and ground by the looks of it. More grinding grit. That's a nice finish with a chamfered bottom, so it goes in this way so that it won't accidentally be canted because of some debris or something. So that was a nice touch if you're not going to be super careful with your machining. But the face of the vise jaw, the mounting point, is just machined, not ground. So if you can't see it, they didn't grind it, which I guess you can sort of get because they're trying to look for ways to save money. More grinding grit back there. And also a relieved corner, so they didn't have to worry about the jaws being pushed away. The jaws are very well ground. They stick together almost enough to hold the whole weight of the jaw. So that's pretty cool. Let's remove this fixed jaw off of here. That's a hefty bolt. Oh, this is a very tight fit. It's a pleasant surprise. This guy's keyed in here and a very nice fit. And that actually is ground, not just machined. Key stock's kind of interesting. They didn't really cut them to size. They just cut them off, left burrs on the end, which means you can't get this out the end until I pop these keys out of here. Those keys were really tight fit. Here's the other part of the thrust bearing, the hardened washer. So we're going to clean the grease off of these to get the grinding grit off. This is all kind of rough, but the shaft, they say the shaft is hardened and it looks like it was heat treated. So I think I can buy that. Again, tons of grit in all these locations here. Oh, and there's some nice burrs too. So we're gonna have to stone that off or even grind it potentially to get that smooth. That fits under the bottom of the vise here. And one more thing I notice is these threads are well cut, but they didn't bother running some fine sandpaper over them. We could probably improve how this thing rotates by cleaning these threads up a bit. So we'll take some Kratex and clean them out because these are pretty sharp. I've cleaned up the shaft threads and they have a good feel to them now. There's none of the crunchiness that there was going around before. The end had some burrs on it, so I took that off as well. So that's nicely cleaned up now. Also, where they did a countersink here for the set screw here to fit into, that had turned up a burr, so I cleaned that off as well. This is not a hardened shaft. They claimed it was, but if it is, my file went into it like butter, so I'm thinking not. So anyways, so this will wear out, but for the price, how can you complain? So I ran this guy through the surface grinder, just these surfaces here. You can tell that, well, one side was about 1/1000th more than the other side. They put a little bit of relief in here and it's almost gone on this side and still here on this side. They weren't careful when they ground it, but now this side should be roughly flat and parallel to this side. And importantly, now it's very smooth. Before it was not. Okay, so before we head over the surface plate, I'm going to take my die grinder and I'm just going to relieve all these sharp edges that are everywhere. They're all razor sharp and could cut you. This one's not as bad. They should have made them all like this. But again, more work, and fit and finish is not what you get when you pay 80 bucks for a $500 vise, right? So what we're looking at was one side. It's coming up back up the other side. And the end where the jaw almost never sits, it's only this last centimeter or 1/2 inch that actually has the issue with the rise. The rest is within a couple tenths, which absolutely blows me away that it's that accurate. Now that I've stoned this guy, we're getting between 1/2 thou and relative to itself, the inside is within a couple, oh geez, I just screwed up my measurement there, a couple tenths. It is surprisingly good. Then you go from inside to the outside's just a little bit lower, but by about 1/2 thou to overall a thou in worst case. I'm going to take this guy over the surface grinder. The problem is I don't have a rotary base for it. Maybe I should wait before I grind this to get a rotary grinder. Basically a rotary base that's very, very flat and parallel with the surface grinder, because I can come across here and I can get this side and this side, but I'll miss a stripe on both sides. Then I got to rotate 90 to get that. And I'm not sure that I can do that and ensure that there's no grit that gets underneath it. Ah, heck, let's give it a try. We're 1 1/2 thousandths off of parallel here, so we're gonna give it a shot. I did a really crude job of grinding this, just rotating it in place on this, on the mag chuck, on the surface grinder, and we're within 3/10 now everywhere, which is surprisingly good. All right, so I'm just going to reassemble this guy, and let's see, this guy, it's going to capture this guy, so this goes this way. And I need to get this in first. It's also reverse thread. I cleaned up these threads and now they're so much smoother. And I guess I should oil them. Okay. Boy, this thing is so smooth now by comparison. And might as well put the thrust washers in here. Now they slide on smoothly, unlike before. And I think we're going to go straight for attaching this guy right off the bat. And it does have a location for the set screw. So we'll try and get this guy right back on there. The burr was so bad that I thought it actually threaded on. Just make sure the oiler's working here. I like to make sure there's oil under all the parts, like the fixed jaw, so that you don't get rust. So I can tap in the two keyways, which I think is kind of weird that, you know, they just cut it off. There's the burr left over the saw. I'm going to go remove that. By the way, these are not hardened keys. They're soft iron. That's one of the ways they made this fit so snugly, is that everything has to fit over. You know, as long as we're going to do this, let's add some Vactra there. All right. So I put some molybdenum disulfide grease on the point where they meet. It's not a hemisphere like in a Kurt Vise. That was much more expensive machining than I think these guys wanted to engage in. Setting how tight this is sets how smooth the jaw moves. You can get it so there's almost no wiggle. I think it might be not a bad idea to back it up with another set screw so that once you get a setting you like, it will still move freely. However, this is pretty darn smooth with the handle. Not so much here. No play at all in the jaw, which is probably what you want. Snugged up the jaws, tapped them with a soft blow hammer, and now the jaws line up so that I can't feel the point where they come together, so that's really good. I was using a wrench to get motion on the jaws really quickly. It's a ratcheting box end. Now I can give these guys a final snug. Gotta load these bolts in from the bottom. Set the vise on here. These are not hardened steel. I'll have to get some. I had these around. These are much thicker. If you look at the difference there, these are almost over 2 millimeters thick. These are less than 1. So they'll be an improvement even if they're not completely solving the problem. Should have hardened washers on here. This is much, much smoother. Now, remember that crunchiness you were hearing before? This is very, very smooth. It's interesting, little T-nuts. The T-nut slot is not, it's just rough cast iron, and the T-nuts, interestingly enough, just catch on the edge. They're not, they're hardened, it looks like, but they just catch on the edge of this material here. So you definitely don't want to do anything really heavy involved in this, because I think these things would break out the casting One last thing I noticed here was the graduations are kind of weird. There's a spot here where they could have put a hash mark. They did not. I guess they leave that for you to add a hash mark if you want to. This is 0 here, but I wouldn't be able to put this on my ways like this because I couldn't get to the bolts. I suppose you could line it up if you had vertical ways on something and tighten it. Instead, it's going to be at the 90 position, which is a little unusual. I think I would have chosen 0 for that. But here's 90, so line that up with the ways, and then you got to put a hash mark. You could indicate this in, and then set this dead at 90, put a hash mark there when you're done. I guess they didn't provide one for you. I think that's a little weird, but a minor quibble. Interestingly enough, it came with spare washers for right here and spare T-nuts, as a matter of fact, which I think is really unusual that they'd bother doing that. It came with screws and slot shims that help you line this thing fairly closely. These are not ground. Well, I don't think they're ground. I think they're cast, actually. It's kind of interesting just looking at these guys. I think they're cast or powdered metal. Maybe powdered metal. That's really kind of interesting, actually, because I don't see much in the way of tooling marks anywhere. And this little ridge here, I kind of think this is powdered metal. Anyways, these fit in the T-slots below here to line it up with ways if you have a small mill. My mill would be too big for these. I'd have to have a stepped one of these. But still, the fact that it came with them, they're not tight in there. You hear that slot side to side. But the fact they came with them at all is kind of nice. It would help you get close in alignment. By the way, you can hear how smooth this rotates now that I ground it just a little bit. Really rough surface grinding. So all in all, I think this vise is a pretty amazing deal for the money. As far as flatness, you had about 8/10 across the entire length of this, which with most of it being 3/10 until you get to about the last centimeter here, in which case it rises up. The base, the center part was about 1/1000th, well, about 1/2 different than the outside on the rotating portion here, and that's not ideal. So it's not going to sit and disperse the weight very evenly. So I ground that flat, but even if you can't, it'll still work. If you're looking for a vise for a small milling machine and you're looking for accuracy around 1/1000th or so, I think you could pull it off with this vise. And for 79 bucks compared to the 4-inch Kurt, which is like 500 and something, I think it's a really good deal. I think Vevor did an amazing job considering the price point they're selling this at. You're definitely going to want to replace the washers on this guy. These aren't even adequate. You really want hardened steel washers. I think it's a bonus they came with extra T-bolts and nuts on that, although that's a little disconcerting. They think that they need to. These are rated supposedly 8.8, but anyways, I think it's also nice that they've got slot guides in here, slot shims. That's a nice touch, even though they're not ground and they're not very accurate. They slop around a lot. The ones on the Kurt fit like you'd expect the keyway to fit. The keys in this guy also are soft material, so not super hard and not super strong. So you're probably, when you crank on this, if you go for the full 3,000 pounds of force, you're going to get a little lift on the rear jaw, I suspect. But what do you expect for $80? I think it's a pretty darn good price, and I think Vevor's got an excellent product for the money. I can't believe they ground as many surfaces as they did, even though it's not fine finishing grinding, it's rough grinding. Still, pretty darn impressive. Anyways, hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next time.